Have you ever wondered why some of the most brilliant minds in history struggled inside a traditional classroom? Why the kids who couldn't sit still, couldn't follow pointless rules, or couldn't stop questioning everything, later became the ones who built companies, launched revolutions, or reshaped entire industries? Modern research makes something very clear. The students who followed rules the best often ended up being the least innovative as adults, while nonconformists were far more likely to create something original. A University of Pennsylvania study found that rule breakers were 27% more likely to become entrepreneurs than their compliant peers. Think about that. The students who were praised, rewarded, and held up as the model examples were statistically the least likely to disrupt anything. If our education system was designed to create independent thinkers, that outcome would be a disaster. But if the system was designed to create obedient, predictable citizens who follow orders without friction, then it's functioning flawlessly. And this is exactly the kind of question Machiavelli would raise, because he understood something people still miss today. Systems of control work best when they don't look like systems of control at all. As he famously wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are." Modern education is built on that same principle, shaping minds while pretending to liberate them. Before we go further, let's make something absolutely clear. This is not an attack on teachers. Most teachers care deeply about their students. We're talking about the system itself, the architecture that was created long before any current teacher stepped into a classroom. And when you trace that architecture back, you find something surprising. The modern education system was not designed by child development experts. It wasn't built to nurture curiosity or develop strategic thinkers. It was shaped by industrialists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, factory owners who needed workers who would arrive on time, follow instructions, and tolerate monotony. They weren't looking for innovators or creators. They wanted compliance. Charles Eliot, president of Harvard University in 1905, said it outright. One class of people would receive a liberal education, and a much larger class would be trained only for specific, difficult, manual tasks. 2 tracks. One for rulers, one for labor. Machiavelli would have recognized the brilliance of this immediately. A subtle but powerful division of society into leaders and followers, all while maintaining the illusion that everyone has equal opportunity. But here's the twist. Around the world, there are examples showing that a different kind of education is not only possible, but wildly effective. Finland consistently ranks among the world's most successful education systems, yet it uses minimal standardized testing, emphasizes autonomy, and gives children far more freedom. And still its outcomes are better. But Machiavelli would warn you, what benefits the people does not always benefit those in power. A compliant population is easier to manage. A curious population is harder to contain. Look at the small rules you grew up with, rules that had nothing to do with learning. No chewing gum. Walk only on this side of the hallway. Raise your hand for permission to speak. Don't question the rubric. These rules weren't about developing intelligence. They were about shaping obedience. Research confirms that children often follow rules they don't understand simply because an authority figure gave them. That's conditioning, not education. Machiavelli advised rulers to give people the illusion of order, not actual autonomy, because when people are trained to obey without questioning, they become easier to govern as adults, and that is exactly what traditional schools excel at. Contrast that with Sugata Mitra's famous hole-in-the-wall experiment, where children in India, given nothing but a computer and freedom, taught themselves complex concepts without instruction. They learned through curiosity, collaboration, and intrinsic motivation. In other words, they learned the way nature intended, which is precisely why Machiavelli would say that such freedom is dangerous to any system that wants citizens who follow rather than challenge. But conditioning goes even deeper than discipline. School trains you to depend on external validation, gold stars, grades, rankings, teacher approval. And once your self-worth is tied to other people's judgments, you're easy to manipulate for the rest of your life. Machiavelli observed that people judge more by the eye than by the hand, meaning they prefer appearances over truth. And so does education. It rewards performance over depth, scores over learning, certainty over curiosity. The result? Adults who doubt their own judgment and constantly seek approval, from bosses, from institutions, from society. Adults who fear mistakes because they were punished for them, not taught through them. Adults who avoid risk because school conditioned them to believe that being wrong is shameful. Meanwhile, the most transformative thinkers, the ones who changed the world, usually struggled in traditional classrooms. Richard Branson dropped out at 16. Steve Jobs dropped out of college but wandered into a calligraphy class that later influenced Apple's entire design philosophy. They succeeded not because of the system, but because they escaped it. School teaches compliance. Life rewards courage, even though traditional education can restrict your natural potential. Machiavelli himself would still argue that the right kind of education is essential for anyone who wants to lead, influence, or think independently. In The Prince, he insists that anyone who hopes to foresee the future must study the past, because human behavior repeats itself more than we care to admit. And that's where the story shifts. Not all education is crippling. Some forms of learning sharpen your instincts, deepen your understanding of human nature, and prepare you to navigate a complex world with clarity and strategic insight. Think about leaders who shaped history with precision. Winston Churchill using historical understanding to navigate World War II. Or Angela Merkel relying on decades of political and scientific knowledge to manage some of the most complex crises of the 21st century. These weren't rule followers. They were thinkers who understood context, patterns, and power dynamics, exactly the kind of knowledge Machiavelli believed was essential for leadership. But here's the irony. The very skills that turn someone into an effective leader, critical thinking, interdisciplinary curiosity, strategic patience, are not the ones traditional education cultivates. Instead, schools fragment knowledge into disconnected subjects. History sits over here. Science sits over there. Economics is separate. Philosophy is a footnote. You're taught to pass exams, not to integrate ideas. Machiavelli would call this intellectual fragmentation a kind of disarmament. Because when you can't see the world as an interconnected system, you can't see power structures clearly. You can't see patterns. You can't see the traps. And if you can't see the traps, you can't avoid them. One of the most effective strategies rulers use is to prevent citizens from recognizing how systems actually work. Fragment knowledge, and you fragment understanding. Fragment understanding, and you fragment resistance. It's simple. It's elegant. It's effective. Schools also teach you to compete with your peers for scarce rewards, class ranks, curved grades, college admissions. This is Machiavellian, in the purest sense. Divide people, make them compete, and they'll never unify against the system controlling them. Machiavelli literally advised rulers to sow discord among citizens because unified groups become dangerous. And then there's the fear of failure. Ask yourself, what did school teach you about making mistakes? Probably something like, mistakes equals punishment. Mistakes equals shame. Mistakes equals falling behind. But the real world doesn't work that way. Innovation requires failure. Entrepreneurship demands experimentation. Leadership requires risk. Yet school punishes risk and rewards caution. It trains you to stay inside the box, even when the world desperately needs people who think outside it. Look at Steve Jobs. He said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards." His entire career was built on exploring outside the boundaries school had defined for him. Same with Richard Branson. Same with countless innovators, creators, and leaders whose greatness didn't come from being a star student, but from breaking away from the conditioning that star students absorbed. But here's where Machiavelli would draw a line. He never claimed that all structure is harmful. Instead, he believed that the right challenges, the right struggles, and the right adversities forge strong, capable leaders. Military academies, leadership institutes, and high-performance programs build resilience by pushing people to confront discomfort, not hide from it. They understand what Machiavelli wrote centuries ago: obstacles shape character. Difficulty creates discipline, and discipline creates power. At the same time, modern educational alternatives, like Montessori or big-picture learning, demonstrate something interesting. When children are given freedom to explore, pursue their interests, and think across disciplines, they develop exactly the qualities Machiavelli believed rulers needed: judgment, initiative, curiosity, strategic analysis, no fear of failure, no dependence on approval. So, what does that mean for you? It means the most valuable skill you can develop is internal validation, trusting your judgment even when it goes against what others expect. Machiavelli believed leaders must rely on their own counsel, not the opinions of the crowd. He understood that people who depend on external approval become pliable, influenceable, controllable. Ask yourself, what would I believe if no one else's opinion mattered? What would I build if no one was grading me on it? What would I create if I knew I didn't need permission? This is the beginning of intellectual independence. And once you build that, something else becomes possible: interdisciplinary thinking. Connecting ideas that school kept separate. Seeing patterns others miss. Understanding how psychology affects politics. How economics shapes behavior. How history predicts the future. Machiavelli would tell you that the person who sees the full board, not just the pieces, is the one who wins the game. This is why some of the most impactful educational approaches today give students real-world experiences, not just textbook knowledge. They put learners into internships, let them explore passions, connect theory to reality, and the results speak for themselves: higher graduation rates, better long-term outcomes, deeper engagement. But the most Machiavellian lesson of all is this: understanding how a system tries to shape you gives you power over that system. Awareness becomes immunity. When you see how you were conditioned, trained to comply, to seek approval, to avoid risk, you stop being controlled by it. You start choosing your own path. You start turning conditioning into consciousness. Once you begin to notice the hidden patterns behind your education, something powerful happens. You start to see the entire world differently. You begin to realize that school was never just about teaching math, reading, or history. It was about shaping behavior, about training you to fit into a system, not to question it. And once you see that, you can reclaim control. But awareness is only the first step. The next step, the step Machiavelli would insist on, is to actively reshape yourself. Internal validation was the starting point. But now we move into something deeper: interdisciplinary thinking. Because Machiavelli was not simply a political thinker. He was a strategist, a historian, a psychologist, a social scientist long before those fields existed. He understood something modern schools suppress. When knowledge is divided into boxes, people lose the ability to see how the world actually works. That's why he drew from everything: warfare, diplomacy, human nature, economics, past empires, to form an understanding of power that still shapes governments today. If you want to become a free thinker, you must do the same. When you study history, ask how psychology shaped those events. When you study science, consider the ethical and political forces behind it. When you study business, look at how culture and power influence decisions. When you learn anything, connect it to everything, because the world isn't divided into subjects. Only schools are. Schools separate knowledge so people never fully understand systems, financial systems, political systems, social systems. And when you don't understand the system you're living in, you can't operate strategically inside it. This is why alternative models like big picture learning have exploded in success. Their entire structure is built on one core idea: learning should be connected to life. Students spend time in internships, work with mentors, discover their passions, then bring those real-world insights back to the classroom. Their graduation rates surpass traditional schools by a wide margin, not because the students are smarter, but because the system actually encourages curiosity, autonomy, and real application. Now, Machiavelli would take this a step further. He would say, independent thinking is not enough. You must also master strategic risk-taking. In The Prince, he writes, all courses of action are risky, meaning there is no safe path. There is only the illusion of safety. And school teaches you to cling to that illusion, avoid mistakes, avoid uncertainty, avoid being wrong. But leaders don't avoid risk. They calculate it. That's why successful innovators often keep failure resumes, lists of their mistakes, risks, and attempts, not to shame themselves, but to track their evolution. Stanford teaches this practice for a reason. The people who fail with intention learn faster and advance farther. Meanwhile, people who avoid risk fall into stagnation. They stay in the same job for years, afraid to move. They stay in the same relationship, afraid to be alone. They stay in the same mindset, afraid to confront the unfamiliar. Machiavelli believed the timing of action mattered more than the action itself. The wise don't rush. They observe. They study. They wait for the moment when a single move has maximum impact. The wise man does at once what the fool does finally, he wrote. In modern terms, don't wait for permission. Don't wait for certainty. Don't wait for life to hand you an opening. Create one or recognize one before others see it. But something else must happen at this stage. Community. Not the kind school forced on you. A community of thinkers. People who question systems, challenge assumptions, and push each other into deeper insight. Because awakening is contagious. Many people never break free from their educational conditioning because they are surrounded by those who reinforce it. Be realistic. Don't make waves. That's not how things are done. Be grateful. These are the phrases of the conditioned mind. And once you step outside that mindset, you see how limiting it truly is. This is what happened to Alex Chen, a developer who realized the limits of his education when he met others who were breaking out of the same box. They built learning spaces together, things no single person could have imagined. Because when independent thinkers collaborate, they don't create small ideas, they create new realities. The point is this: if you want to operate at a higher level, surround yourself with strategic minds, not obedient ones. After this, we reach a powerful turning point, something far bigger than personal development, something institutional. Because Machiavelli would insist, individual change is essential, but systemic change is where societies transform. And education systems do not change easily, but they can change. project-based learning, internships, interdisciplinary curricula, real-world problem-solving. These are not fantasies. They already exist and already work. High Tech High in San Diego is a prime example. No traditional classes, no memorization focus, no separation of subjects. Instead, projects that combine history, engineering, design, and communication. Students work like actual thinkers, not machines. Other countries have implemented nationwide changes. Finland gives teachers autonomy instead of micromanagement. Students have lighter schedules, more play, less testing, and yet achieve extraordinary results. Machiavelli would say this proves one thing. Educational systems aren't limited by what's possible, only by what's profitable for those in power. And then comes perhaps the most important question of all. If the system shaped you, what will you do now that you see the shaping? Because here's the paradox Machiavelli would appreciate. Once you understand how you were controlled, you can no longer be controlled the same way. Awareness is the first revolution. Action is the second. The moment you begin questioning the system that shaped you, you step onto a path most people never dare to walk. Because once you see the architecture behind your conditioning, you can't unsee it. And now the choice becomes yours. Do you keep living according to a framework designed for compliance? Or do you build a new internal framework designed for power, clarity, and autonomy? Machiavelli would argue that this moment, this awakening, is the most dangerous moment in a person's life. Not because the world will punish you for it, but because your old self will. The habits, fears, insecurities, and beliefs you carried for years will try to pull you back into the familiar. Systems don't just shape people. People become attached to the systems that shape them. This is where the next layer of transformation begins. Creating your own system of learning, one that exists outside institutional frameworks entirely. Schools measure success through grades, rankings, test scores, and compliance. But your new system must measure success through something radically different. Skills mastered, problem solved, thoughts clarified, projects completed, insights gained, self-respect cultivated. These are metrics no institution will ever teach you to use because they create independence, not dependency. So here is Machiavelli's next principle for the modern world. 1. Build your own internal compass. Machiavelli believed that a leader must never be ruled by external praise or criticism. Praise makes you complacent. Criticism makes you defensive. Both make you predictable, and predictable people are easy to manipulate. So, ask yourself, what would I pursue if I didn't care about approval? What would I study if no one could grade me? What would I build if failure wasn't a threat? If you can answer those questions honestly, you've already begun to dismantle conditioning that took decades to form. But there's another layer, knowing your natural learning style. Traditional schools force you into a single method lectures, memorization, timed tests. But human beings learn through wildly different pathways. Some learn visually, others learn by doing. Some need isolation, others need dynamic environments. Some learn through struggle, others through exploration. Schools flatten these differences because uniformity is easier to manage. Your task now is to unflatten yourself. Discover how you learn. Because when learning is aligned with your nature, mastery becomes inevitable, too. You must become an interdisciplinary thinker. Machiavelli didn't think in categories. Politics, psychology, history, warfare, economics. They were all connected in his mind. And this is why his insights remain relevant 500 years later. He understood the entire system. Think of it like this. A person who only knows one field can be replaced. A person who sees across fields becomes irreplaceable. So when you study something, anything, ask, What does this teach me about people? What does this reveal about incentives? How does this connect to power, behavior, conflict, or opportunity? What pattern repeats here? This is how you train your mind to see what others overlook. It's how you stop living inside the puzzle and start seeing the puzzle from above. And this leads to the next transformation. 3. You must stop avoiding risk and start using it strategically. School punishes mistakes, but life punishes stagnation. What traditional education calls failure, Machiavelli would call intelligence gathering. Every risk teaches you something the safe path never could. But the key is strategic risk, not blind leaps, not impulsive gambles. Strategic risk is measured, deliberate, timed. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote, "Fortune favors the bold," a phrase people misunderstand constantly. He never meant recklessness. He meant that boldness rooted in calculation wins. He meant that opportunities come to those who prepare for them, not those who wait for permission. So, here's a question only the brave will answer. Which risk in your life have you avoided because school conditioned you to fear being wrong? That fear is your leash. Cut it, and your world expands. 4. Create alliances based on awareness, not convenience. Machiavelli understood the immense power of alliances, but he also understood how dangerous the wrong alliances can be. Most people surround themselves with whoever is nearby. Co-workers, childhood friends, familiar faces. But proximity-based relationships rarely build growth. They build comfort. You need something else now, a circle that pushes you forward, not holds you in place. People who ask higher-level questions. People who dissect systems and patterns. People who reject blind obedience. People who challenge your thinking instead of validating your stagnation. Alex Chen's story, which we revisited earlier, proves this. His transformation didn't come from solitary awakening. It came from finding others who were asking the same forbidden questions. Together, they built something none of them could have created alone. Your growth will accelerate the moment you stop bonding over shared limitations and start bonding over shared vision. 5. Recognize that systems can be redesigned. Most people believe institutions are fixed, permanent, immovable. But Machiavelli knew better. He understood that every structure, political, educational, economic, is designed by someone, and therefore can be redesigned by someone else. Look at High-Tech High. Look at Finland. Look at project-based learning schools around the world. They prove that education can be more human, more strategic, more adaptive. These systems didn't wait for permission from the old guard. They built something new, and the results are undeniable. But Machiavelli would also add a warning. Systems do not change themselves. They are changed by people who see clearly. You can't reform a system you're still trapped inside. You can't innovate while you're still afraid of being graded. You can't create while you're still conditioned to seek approval. 6. Become the architect of your own evolution. Here is where the transformation becomes personal. Once you understand how education shaped you and how it continues to influence your choices, you must decide whether you will keep living through inherited patterns or build your own. Ask yourself, which part of my personality was trained, not chosen? Which fears were taught to me, not discovered? Which dreams are mine, and which were assigned by the system? These questions are uncomfortable. But Machiavelli believed discomfort sharpens a person more than comfort ever could. And then comes the paradox he would appreciate more than anyone. The system's greatest weakness is your awareness of it. Once you see how it conditioned you, it loses control. Once you understand its motives, it loses influence. Once you reclaim your mind, it cannot reclaim you. This is why most people never reach this point. Because awakening is messy. It requires questioning everything that felt safe. But on the other side of that questioning lies something far more powerful: sovereignty. Reaching this final stage means one thing. You're no longer just seeing the system, you're standing outside of it. You're no longer shaped by the conditioning that once defined you. Now, the real work begins. Because awareness without action changes nothing. Machiavelli would say that understanding a system's power is only the first step. The next step is learning how to wield your own. Most people awaken just enough to complain, but not enough to transform. They understand what limited them, but they continue to move as if those limits are still in place. That cannot be your path now. The moment you recognize how you were trained to think, fear, hesitate, and obey, you are responsible for rewriting those patterns. Here are the final pillars Machiavelli would insist on as you rebuild yourself, not as a product of the system, but as the architect of your own evolution. 1. Stop waiting for someone else to validate your direction. School taught you to wait for permission, to raise your hand, to defer to authority, to do only what you're told. That conditioning shows up today every time you hesitate before taking a leap you know you should take. But here's the truth. Your life will not begin until you stop asking for approval and start granting it to yourself. No leader waits to be chosen. Leaders choose themselves. Every significant step forward will feel like defiance because it is. 2. Build internal standards that no one else can touch. As long as your worth depends on external applause, you remain easy to influence. Machiavelli understood this deeply. A person who lives for praise becomes a puppet to those who withhold it. So you must shift your measurement system. Not, did they approve? But, did I act with intention? Not, was this impressive? But, was this aligned with who I'm becoming? This transition from external evaluation to internal mastery is what turns a follower into a force. 3. See the world through interconnected lenses. Traditional education shattered knowledge into isolated categories, but Machiavelli saw everything as one system. Human behavior shaping politics, psychology shaping decisions, incentives shaping morality. To think like a strategist, you must train your mind to connect fields that school kept separate. When money moves, ask what fear or ambition is driving it. When people react emotionally, ask what incentive shaped that emotion. When power shifts, ask what weakness made it possible. Pattern recognition is power, and interdisciplinary thinking is how you acquire it. 4. Accept that risk is unavoidable and choose it strategically. School conditioned you to fear mistakes, but life punishes stagnation far more than failure. Machiavelli believed that fortune rarely favors the passive. Boldness matters, not reckless boldness, but calculated action. Strategic risk means you study before you act. You wait for timing instead of rushing. You commit fully when the moment appears. Every opportunity in your life will require a moment of courage. Hesitation is the only guaranteed loss. 5. Maintain your new identity even when others resist. As you break out of your old conditioning, people will react. Some will be inspired. Others will feel threatened. They will say you're different, distant, too focused, too sharp. But remember, people who depended on your old limits will always resist your new boundaries. Your growth is not an attack. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Hold your trajectory. 6. Design a life where you define the terms. This is the final transformation. Shifting from reacting to shaping. You choose what you learn, what you pursue, who has access to you, how you spend your time, which vision guides your decisions. This is what Machiavelli meant by true power, not dominating others, but owning yourself so completely that nothing external can bend your direction. A person with self-governance becomes impossible to manipulate, impossible to predict, impossible to control. So now ask yourself quietly, honestly, which old rule will you no longer obey? Which fear will you stop repeating? Which step will you take today that the old you avoided? This is the moment where understanding becomes identity, where clarity becomes action, where you stop inheriting a life and start constructing one. If you want, I can now help you craft a polished narration version, a cinematic script, or a shorter YouTube-ready version. Just tell me what you need next.